Imagine standing next to a machine that looks like it was carved by the wind itself. It sits low to the ground, aggressive, painted in a color that seems to vibrate even when the car is parked. It is the culmination of a century of automotive evolution. The engine is a masterpiece of aluminum and silicon, capable of screaming at 9,000 revolutions per minute. The suspension is active, thinking faster than you can blink. The interior smells of success. You have spent years dreaming of this moment, saving for it, perhaps sacrificing for it. You turn the key, or push the start button, and that glorious, mechanical symphony erupts behind your head. You pull out onto the highway, the world blurring into a streak of color, the adrenaline surging through your veins. You feel invincible, and then, in a fraction of a second, the dream dies. It doesn't end with a crash. It doesn't end with a dramatic explosion. It ends with a sudden, sinking feeling in your stomach as a warning light flashes on the dashboard. The temperature gauge spikes instantly to the red. Steam, thick and acrid, begins to billow from the engine bay, clouding the rear-view mirror. The power cuts, the steering goes heavy. You coast to the shoulder, the sound of passing traffic replacing the roar of your engine. You pop the hood, hoping for something simple, something loose. But deep down, you know. You see the puddle of fluid spreading underneath the car, bleeding out onto the asphalt. And when the mechanic finally gives you the diagnosis, he doesn't blame the $20,000 transmission or the hand-built crankshaft. He holds up a small, unassuming piece of plastic. A connector, a seal, a tension, a part that costs less than a tank of gas. A $40 piece of mass-produced mediocrity that just destroyed a $200,000 engine. This is the great paradox of the modern super. We tend to look at these vehicles as monolithic blocks of perfection. We imagine that because the badge on the hood says Ferrari, or Porsche, or McLaren, that every single bolt and washer has been blessed by the gods of engineering. We assume that if a car costs as much as a house, it must be built with the durability of a bunker. But the reality is far more fragile. The reality is that these titans of the road are often brought to their knees not by complex failures of high-tech systems, but by the simplest, cheapest corners cut in the darkest recesses of the engine bay. To understand how this happens, you have to understand the mind of the manufacturer. When a company sets out to build a supercar, the budget is immense, but it is not infinite. The money goes into the headlines. It goes into the carbon fiber monocoque that saves weight. It goes into the complex dual-clutch gearbox that shifts in milliseconds. It goes into the aerodynamics that keep the car glued to the road at speeds that would make a Cessna take flight. These are the things that sell cars. These are the stats that end up on the brochure and in the YouTube reviews. But an engine is an incredibly complex organism, comprised of thousands of individual components. And somewhere, deep in the supply chain, a decision is made. An engineer needs to route coolant from one side of the engine V to the other. Or, they need to seal a shaft that spins inside the engine block. They could spec a machined aluminum part, they could use a high-grade aerospace seal, but the accountants are watching. They see a place to save weight, yes, but mostly a place to save money. They suggest a composite plastic, a molded polymer. It's light, it's cheap to manufacture in the millions. And on the day it rolls off the assembly line, it works perfectly. The problem is that supercars are not normal cars. They generate heat that is difficult to comprehend. The engine bays are tight, enclosed spaces where temperatures soar. A plastic coolant pipe in a Toyota Camry leads a relatively easy life. That same plastic pipe, buried in the valley of a twin-turbo V8, is living in an oven. It heats up, it expands, the engine turns off, it cools down, it contracts. Heat, cool, expand, contract, thousands of times. Over years, slowly, the molecular structure of that $40 part begins to change. The plastic, once pliable and strong, becomes brittle. It turns into something resembling hard candy. It develops microscopic fissures, invisible to the human eye, hidden beneath the intake manifold where no one can see them during a routine inspection. It is a ticking time bomb, counting down every time you go for a drive. There is a specific tragedy in the Porsche 911 lineage that illustrates this perfectly, a story that still haunts owners to this day. For a long time, the engine design used a component called the intermediate shaft bearing, or IMS. It was a simple ball bearing, the kind of thing that looks like it belongs in a skateboard wheel, tasked with driving the camshafts. It was a sealed unit, buried deep inside the engine, intended to last the life of the car. It cost almost nothing to make. But the grease inside the sealed bearing would eventually dry out, or the seal would fail and allow oil to wash the grease away. Without lubrication, the metal balls would begin to grind. The driver would hear nothing, maybe a slight rattle at idle, easily dismissed as the quirks of a flat-six engine. And then, at highway speeds, the bearing would disintegrate, the timing chain would skip, pistons would collide with valves in a chaotic, catastrophic dance of destruction. The engine would essentially eat itself from the inside out, a $15,000 replacement bill caused by a bearing that could be bought for the price of a nice lunch. It wasn't a failure of performance, it was a failure of penny. This isn't isolated to one brand. It is a plague that infects the highest echelons of the automotive world. Consider the Italian exotics. We forgive them their temperamental nature because they have souls, or so we tell ourselves. But is it soulful when a cheap rubber hose fails, spraying flammable fluid onto a hot exhaust manifold, burning the car to the ground? This happens more often than we like to admit. We see the photos on social media, beautiful, exotic skeletons sitting on the side of the highway, charred and black. We assume the owner was driving too fast, or that the car was too powerful. Often, it was just a clamp that lost its tension, or a rubber line that wasn't heat shielded properly. A $40 oversight turning a work of art into a pile of ashdot. There is a psychological element to this failure that makes it sting more than any other. If you buy a cheap car and the door handle falls off, you laugh. You expect it. It confirms your worldview that you get what you pay for. But when you buy a supercar, you are buying into a myth of invincibility. You are buying the best of what humanity can create. When that myth is shattered by a cheap component, it feels like a betrayal. It feels personal. It forces you to realize that underneath the leather and the badge, it is just a machine, assembled by humans who had deadlines and budget constraints. And the cruelty is in the labor. That is the true killer. The part itself is $40. But to get to it, that is where the nightmare begins. Because these cars are packaged so tightly, designed for aerodynamics and weight distribution rather than serviceability, nothing is accessible. To replace that $5 O-ring or that $40 plastic thermostat housing, the mechanic often has to drop the entire engine and transmission out of the car. The subframe has to come down. The suspension has to be dismantled. You are paying for 20, 30, 40 hours of expert labor at hundreds of dollars an hour just to reach the cheap part that failed. The repair bill isn't for the fix. The repair bill is for the excavation. Yet, there is a strange silver lining to this fragility. It has birthed an entire subculture of guardians. Because the factories failed, the enthusiasts stepped up. If you dive into the forums and the owners' clubs, you find the true engineers. You find small machine shops that looked at the plastic factory part, shook their heads, and milled a replacement out of billet aluminum. They realized the weakness and they engineered it out. They created the forever fix. There is something beautiful about that. It shows that the love for these cars transcends the manufacturers themselves. The owners love the machines enough to finish the job that the factory started. They install the upgraded bearings, the metal coolant pipes, the reinforced brackets. They perfect the imperfections. They take the $40 weak link and replace it with something that will last 1,000 years. But until you do that, until you bulletproof the idol, you are driving on borrowed time. You are participating in a high-stakes gamble every time you leave the garage. You are trusting your joy, your investment, and your safety to a piece of injection-molded plastic that was chosen by an accountant who never met you and never drove the car. It forces a shift in perspective. When you see a supercar scream past you on the highway now, don't just listen to the exhaust note. Don't just admire the lines. Think about the tension holding it all together. Think about the immense forces pulling at every bolt and pressurizing every hose. It is a miracle that they work at all. It is a high-wire act of physics and finance, balanced on a razor's edge. So, the next time you look at a listing for a used super and the price seems temptingly low, and you start doing the math in your head, thinking you can afford the monthly payments, stop. Remember the $40 part. Remember that the entry fee is just the beginning. The car may have depreciated to the price of a family sedan, but the parts prices have not. And that tiny, hidden component, deep in the dark heart of the engine, doesn't care about your dreams. It doesn't care about the badge on the hood. It is just waiting for the right moment, the right temperature, the right vibration, to let go, and when it does, it leaves you with silence. The heavy, expensive silence of a dream that just woke up to reality.